Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Terrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us this morning for this very important conversation. And I also want to say thank you to our co-host, the Minneapolis NAACP, who will be recording and streaming this event live on social media. There's actually a link in the chat to their page if you want to watch the live feed. Thank you to our panelists. In a moment, I'll have you all introduce yourselves. Just a few logistics. There's a poll that will appear in the chat for attendees to be able to share some of their some of their information. Basically, we just want to know who comes to these things, where are you from in general, and what kind of work do you do in general. And then there's a question about leadership that we hope that you would answer, because it sets up the next conversation that we'll be hosting on March 26th. Finally, I just want to say it's Zoom. And so, we would love for people to be able to engage robustly, but on these webinars, you have to put your questions in the chat. And so I just ask that you put your questions in the Q&A using the Q&A feature. If we get a lot of questions, I'll do my best to get us to pivot to prioritize those. If you have comments, use the chat. But if you have specific questions for the panelists, please utilize the Q&A. And with that, I'll give you a quick overview. We'll in a moment, we'll introduce our panelists, have a presentation from our research director, Dr. Katie Remington Cunningham, who wrote the report we're discussing today, Trust in Policing, the Role of White Supremacy. And then we'll have reactions and robust conversation, I hope. Thank you so much for joining us. Visit MNJRC.org to support our work. We are really excited to be trying to bring people together during a difficult time in our state, but we think we can have an impact, and we invite you to help us do that. So with that, I will turn to our panelists, starting with our co-host, the Minneapolis NAACP. Angela, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Rose. I am the president of the Minneapolis NAACP, and the NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We were started in 1909 after the 1908 Springfield riots. And so that was actually an event of northern race riots where a mob of 5,000 white folk descended upon a Black community in Springfield, Illinois. And that was actually the impetus of a lot of Black, white, interracial leaders that met to form the Niagara movement. And out of the Niagara movement came the NAACP. And from that, the Minneapolis NAACP was founded in 1914 and has been serving the Minneapolis community, the Minneapolis Black community, on issues pertaining to race and social justice ever since, so for over a century. So this is, something that addressing the role of white supremacy in policing, and then also broadly white supremacy in our country currently, is something that we have been fighting to address for over a century. And so thank you so much to the Minnesota Justice Research Center for having this conversation, for posting this report, and then also for broadly making this available for community members to really address these issues within the role of policing, the role of white supremacy in policing, and then also within our country. Thank you.
Thank you to our co-host. I will kick it to Amber Jones, if you would just introduce yourself and your organization.
Thank you, Justin. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great Tuesday. My name is Amber Jones. I am the outreach coordinator for the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage. I've been in this role for almost a year. And the council is one of the state's ethnic councils that have been around for over 40 years. We were created by state statute in 1980, so we just celebrated 40 years as a council. And we are charged with really representing the interests of Minnesotans of African heritage in state leadership, and really being able to support communities' participation and ensuring that our communities benefit from the state's social, economic, and political efforts and the policies and procedures of the state. And so we are a state agency. We advise the governor and the legislature on issues that affect us. And obviously this is one of the most important issues that affect us since we have been in this country, how white supremacy is affecting our lives on a daily basis. And in particular for today's conversation, how it affects our law enforcement entities. And so we are really working right now is the legislative session. So we are focused a lot on the legislature, in particular bills, and also policies that may be coming up that interact with the holistic welfare of Black folks here in the state, but also when it comes to criminal justice, policing, and public safety. This is one of our top issue areas that we are focusing on. And so we are really excited to be here and be a part of the conversation and to continue our work with the Justice Research Center, with the NAACP, with the Urban League, and with our partners throughout the state. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Amber. And we're supposed to be joined by Nick Muhammad in just a moment. From the Black Civic Network, but Marquita, Ms. Stevens, if you would just introduce yourself and your organization, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marquita Stevens. I am the Director of Education, Programming, and Policy for the Urban League of Twin Cities, a nearly 100-year-old organization offering service in the Minneapolis area initially and more broadly in recent years to the Twin Cities as a whole. Our mission, we are unapologetic and relentless advocates for equity, justice, and power for African descendants.
Thank you, Ms. Director Stevens. That was, so I think people should notice, I mean, it's not a secret. We have legacy Black institutions on this call. And for me as the director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center, I just can't think of a better place to start this conversation than in community with 3 of our legacy Black institutions. I think Nick Muhammad will be joining us later, but for right now, I think we should get into the slides, presentation on the report. And so I'll ask Dr. Katie Remington Cunningham to present an overview of the report we released just a week or so ago, and then we'll have our panelists react to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see slides. Awesome. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I wanna echo the thanks for joining us today. So as Justin said, my name is Katie. I'm the research director for the Minnesota Justice Research Center. And I'm really excited that you've all joined us to hear from an incredible panel of folks who, as they just mentioned, are doing really important work in this space. So I'm going to start off our conversation by presenting a few slides that summarize our recent report on trust in policing and the role of white supremacy. So in this report, we explore what the research shows us about trust in policing, the role of white supremacy in building trust, and some evidence of contemporary examples of white supremacy in policing. We end the report by offering 4 recommendations for policymakers, researchers, and for the general public to really address the explicit connections in particular between law enforcement and individuals who express white supremacist ideologies. So really we see this as a starting point to tackle the larger challenge of white supremacy in policing. So at the Minnesota Justice Research Center, we explore the importance of values like trust in our criminal legal system. And research on trust in policing paints a really clear picture. So trust is low and has been declining, especially in communities of color. For the first time in 27 years, the majority of Americans do not trust the police. So as you can see on this graph, that drop is really significant, but it's also important to note that even when trust was at its height, more than 1/3 of the survey respondents did not have much trust in police. So this is not a new problem. Digging a little deeper into the data, graphs like this one show us that confidence really varies depending on the race of the population surveyed. So since beginning these annual surveys, Gallup has found really consistent differences between Black and white respondents. And as of 2020, you can see that that difference was the largest it has ever been, with 56% of white adults reporting a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in police, compared to just 19% of Black adults surveyed. So a little closer to home here in Minnesota, we can see on this graph, the red bars show us the percentage of white Minnesotans who felt they could trust the police. And we can see about 30 plus 50, so about 80% of white Minnesotans felt like they could trust the police always or most of the time, while only about 20 plus 30 or about 50% of Black Minnesotans felt that way. So again, a pretty significant gap. And when this trust is as low as it is, we dig into the research a little to learn more. So as many scholars have pointed out, the history of law enforcement in the US is inextricably influenced by racism and centuries of white supremacy and Black oppression. White supremacy culture really is baked into our society at every level, and none of us is immune. Whole bodies of sociological and criminological research have really examined the relationship between race, in particular whiteness, and the creation of and the perpetuation of inequities really across sectors, from spaces like education to housing, and in our case, we focus on the criminal legal system. Many researchers have then also examined more closely the role of race in policing in particular. So a really important question is, if white supremacist ideologies are in the air we breathe and in the very foundations of law enforcement, how might communities of color ever trust the police? So we think we need to understand more deeply the role of race in policing to address it. And one way we might start this is by recognizing the continued prevalence and danger of white supremacist ideologies. So for this report in particular, we really focus on the connection between explicit white supremacist ideologies and hate groups and law enforcement. So we examine what the Anti-Defamation League calls sort of the full-fledged ideologies. So these are more explicit, and I might argue less insidious than the white supremacy that characterizes the racism which really plagues our nation. So we want to be really clear. There's a much deeper and challenging issue at play here with the role of white supremacy in policing. But today we start by really examining one part of this problem that the research shows us is really critical. So I want to walk through a few contemporary examples of white supremacy in policing. Starting back in 1995, a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center explicitly warned police and government officials of the growing threat of violence from what they called extremist and militant white supremacists. Then in 2006, the FBI themselves released an intelligence assessment called White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement, in which they described how the presence of white supremacists among law enforcement is a really significant concern. In 2015, so almost a decade later, another FBI report finds links between police and white supremacist group, along with what they call direct infiltration of police departments. And over the past decade, many scholars and journalists have examined this issue in 2016, in 2017, 2019, and 2020, just to point out a few. So these reports that I highlight here use infiltration intelligence, research, and some online data combing, some examination of direct evidence, but often really exploring local incidents that are spread across the US. And the January 6th insurrection on our nation's capital really shines an even brighter light on the problem. The expressions of white supremacist ideologies and affiliations by law enforcement in particular are becoming more emboldened and progressively more explicit and overt. However, there's effectively no publicly available data on the prevalence of white supremacists in law enforcement, perhaps not surprisingly. But instead, most of what we know arises through accidental discovery or through scandal. And so where do we go from here? Well, we recommend the following. So the first step we must take is to talk about this issue, part of why we're having this conversation today. In particular, we think that policymakers and public officials must talk honestly and specifically about the problem of white supremacy in policing. So if public officials can show that they're willing to call the problem by its name and really stop its growth in the shadows for 20 more years, we think we might take a first step toward increasing trust. We also need more accessible data, both on white supremacy in law enforcement and on racial bias in policing more broadly. So as researchers, we really value and seek data to understand and discuss an issue with as much clarity as possible. And while a plethora of examples really highlight the presence of this problem, we still actually don't know much about the nature of the problem. So to really understand the urgent issue of white supremacists in policing, alongside the messier and critical root cause of this issue, so the sort of pervasive structural racism in America, we really need to dig into the nature of this problem. And in addition to collecting more rigorous data on the nature of the relationship between race and police more broadly, we also believe we must move forward with attempts to address this issue. And one place to take action, we think, is to prohibit the licensure of officers who have associations with white supremacist groups or who express these ideologies. We think considering licensure is important, as the data shows us that more responsive accountability measures, things like firing or litigation, really require significant resources and often further erode the public's trust. And finally, as these policies take shape, we also must put evaluation plans into place to determine if and how they work. So there are many instances of interventions and solutions, both in the criminal legal context, but also in social systems more broadly, that are well-meaning, but actually ineffective. So we need to also set out a plan for next steps and longer-term change, part of which really involves determining the metrics we should use to sort of assess and explore whether our work is actually achieving the change we want to see. So trust in policing is a clear challenge. And if we do think that trust might be important, trust in our current system of law enforcement and in whatever future systems of public safety might look like, then we believe we must begin to address the role of white supremacy. So we at the Minnesota Justice Research Center are really committed to this work. And moving forward, we're eager to, as our first recommendation said, to really continue this conversation and then also to encourage further research and action. We invite everyone to read the full report, which you can find on our website, MNJRC.org, on our research page. And we're also really excited to continue this conversation. I'm eager to hear from our panelists, but we also have another conversation set up in a few weeks on March 26th with a panel of researchers and policymakers to really sort of continue the conversation that we have today. Finally, you can always connect with us on our website or social media and share your thoughts. So I'm gonna kick it back to Justin, I think, to sort of open up the conversation. I'm really excited to hear reactions from our panelists. So thank you all for joining us.
Katie, thank you so much for that presentation. Yeah, I feel like let's get into things. So I want to welcome Nick Muhammad to the conversation. Nick, thank you for joining us. We just want to introduce yourself briefly and share about BCN. And then I'll probably come back to you right away and put you on the first question.
Fair enough. Yes. Thank you for having me. My apologies on the technical difficulties. Nick Muhammad, Black Civic Network. I'm one of the directors, executive director and founder. We do a lot of policy work around the Black family and the intersections of electoral votes and policy and community outreach. The two biggest issues that we're working on right now are reparations and the working in partnership and allyship with Khalees Houston and the African American Family Preservation Act. And we also have some other initiatives that we're a part of dealing with police accountability.
Great, great. Thank you for joining us, Nick. The work at BCN is so important, especially the work on the African American Family Preservation Act. I just want to commend you for that, for being a partner on that. So I just have a few questions here for our panelists. So the first one, after seeing the presentation, why do you think trust is low, and what does that mean for public safety in Minnesota? So Nick, I'll go to you first, and then if people want to jump in, if you have a burning reaction to any of the questions, just go ahead and weigh in after the first commenter. And please try to keep your response between a minute to a minute and a half or so.
Okay. I'll keep it very short and simple. It boils down to one word, in our opinion, based on what we've been hearing from people and based on what we see. And that word is accountability of law enforcement when it comes to excessive force, what we consider to be murder, with video evidence. And I don't see, there's no shortcut, there's no program, there's no drive through the neighborhoods and eat barbecue scenario that's going to, install any quick fix to that. The simple solution here is simply justice. We need to make sure that the officers are under the same laws that they put the people that they're so-called supposed to be protecting under. The First Amendment rights need to be protected. Their right to a trial needs to be protected. People are simply not making it to the courtroom, and we are seeing what we see as, vigilante justice in the street in the most barbaric and murderous fashion. And that is not being punished, or there's no accountability for that. And that is what's eroding the trust. You want to restore the trust, send an actual white officer who has committed murder to jail and see the trust literally begin to turn around. If we're not dealing with that and we're not doing that, there's absolutely no way they can have an expectation.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question on why do you think trust is low, and what does it mean for public safety in Minnesota?
I would agree, no justice, no trust. It's really that simple. Trust is based on mutual respect, and we've not seen evidence of that in the behavior of the officers that are in questions, particularly around some of these responses to surveys that we get, some of these focus group answers that we get. The Urban League did one a little over a year ago in concert with the NAACP in this program that we were jointly funded by the Leadership Conference out of DC to deal with policing in the area. And we polled Minneapolis residents and those who work in Minneapolis. It was a small sample, but nonetheless, most of the people that responded were African American, female, had been in the Twin Cities area, either living or working for 10 years or more. So these are people who had some anchor, some experience in the city, who were responding to the survey about policing. And most of the responses to every question was somewhat. People somewhat feel like, there was respect by the officers. The questions were like, how often do you see law enforcement officers where you live, work, or go to school? Do law enforcement people treat you with respect? Have you seen them treat others with respect? Do you feel safe in the presence of law enforcement officers where you live, work, or attend school? Would you call them if you needed help? Do you believe law enforcement officers would make a situation better? The majority of respondents said somewhat. Mm-hmm. Now, if this was a area of life where we could trust them to protect and serve, then you would expect that the answers would be closer to always.
And for other groups, the answers are there, right? Amber, I want to pivot to you on the same question. Why do you think trust is low, and what does that ultimately mean for public safety in Minnesota?
Yeah, and what you were saying, and I think he also showcased a snippet of a poll that the council did. So we're doing a lot of data collection, a lot of research, and we did a poll last summer, and when we spoke to specifically Black Minnesotans, there was about 30 point spread between their trust in police and white Minnesotans' trust in police. And honestly, we have to go to root causes here. We have to really be deeply aware and informed about how the American policing system has morphed throughout American history, and to be very aware of how that history is still very relevant today. We have only been a country for a couple of centuries, if that. And the history still very much presents itself through slavery, in the presence of slave patrols, catching runaway slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act literally was a way to give law enforcement power to catch Black people trying to literally escape for their freedom, and how even after abolition, we have been able to still maintain a level of slavery over Black people by means of mass incarceration, the Black codes, chain gangs, all of these things through Jim Crow, and we're still persisting through the age of mass incarceration. And the gateway into the prison system is through what? Our police, right? That's the gateway into mass incarceration. And then also we are very much aware of just how we see, you know, Nick said the murder of Black people, or how excessive force directed towards Black people at disparate rates. We have all the data, we have all the research. And then at the end of the day, that data and that research represents lived experiences, represents anecdotes, represents stories, represents trauma that persists through generations. This is something that's very deep-seated within our country. It's very deep-seated within this country's history. And I study African-American history in college. And so that's really important to me to understand. Like, none of this is surprising to me when you actually know and understand the legacy in which we are operating in right now. And so I think that is the root and how we start. And I'll put this in the chat because some people will ask, well, how we start, how we learn, how, you know, so on and so forth. I actually listened to this podcast last year. It's a mini series. It came out last summer. In one of the main ways people were responding to the murder of George Floyd. It's called Behind the Police. And it was a mini series that really went into the history of policing in America. I feel like it's a very accessible way to start to learn and understand where we're situated. Because if we don't understand where we're situated and how we got here, we can't talk about the way forward.
So Amber, thanks for providing that resource. And to anyone on the call, like if there are tools or mediums like that help translate this conversation, feel free to drop those resources in the chat. Angela, I'll come to you next with the same question. Just, you know, what does it mean that why do you think trust is so low, and what does it mean for public safety in the state of Minnesota?
Well, I think that one of the things is that Black people, it never really mattered that we trusted the police or not, right? The institution of policing was going to happen whether we trusted it or not, whether we wanted to reform it or not, whether we wanted to abolish it or not. Because at the end of the day, just like Amber mentioned, the institution of policing was to police our bodies, you know, to police our communities. And there's a benefit. You know, like I think the part of policing that people miss is that policing actually and fines and arresting people and bail, and then, you know, there's actually a monetary benefit to the state when you fine and arrest people. And then also there's a benefit of free labor once those people are imprisoned, right? And so there's a benefit to the state. And then there's also a benefit when it comes to white opportunity hoarding, where, you know, then you, through this group of people being arrested, taken from their communities, out of the labor market, and then also out of a lot of opportunities to own homes, to move into the neighborhood that white folk like to keep white, things like that. So there are benefits to over policing our community, and those benefits go to white communities and also to the state. And one of the things where it comes to this idea of trust that you know, it's interesting that we're now asking how will low trust impact public safety? It's now that Black folk are gaining a political power, right? We're gaining a political power and we now have the power to re-examine this institution of policing and actually hold and try to hold these police accountable. Now the question is, okay, well, Black folk now don't trust the police. It's not that we now don't trust the police, it's that it never mattered before, but now it matters. And now when we're talking about public safety, when we're talking about re-envisioning public safety, the question now is for who? Used to be public safety was a safety for white folk. Now it's safety, we're asking for safety for everybody. And so that's what's really important. And also, what does that look like? Now you have a lot of people who, okay, let's just be honest, they're abolitionists. You know, they're abolitionists in Minneapolis. Don't be scared, they're not the boogeyman, but they're there, right? You might disagree, but they're there. And the truth of the matter is they are also talking about re-envisioning public safety in a different way that doesn't include police. Now, that's the conversation that we're in. And unfortunately, there's a tension there because there are folk who see police as fundamental for the upkeep of their everyday life. And they're right, because the police did upkeep their everyday life and their opportunities. You know, they violently preserve their opportunities. Now we're talking about a future where we're not going to see police in the same way, right? Or we're not going to have them, you know. So that's the conversation that you either have to get on board to this new conversation now on. We need to either see and reimagine what policing looks like, what public safety looks like, and what police do, or there's going to be a large group of folk that don't want to see police because as time goes on and how police are violently killing Black folk, you know, terrorizing our communities, that's not something that is in our values as Minnesotans and not as our values as Americans. So that's where we are in this conversation right now. And that trust in policing is trust in the future of police. Let's talk about it. If we want police in the future, okay, let's start trusting that policing will have to look different, that will survive after encounters with them.
I think it goes without saying that there's a couple of dynamics that are that the profession of law enforcement has to address in this moment, specifically white supremacy. We just saw in the Capitol insurrection, you know, we talk about the one officer who was killed on the spot, but like hundreds of officers were injured by white supremacists who raided the Capitol. And I think that it's clear that whatever that dynamic is that exists within law enforcement is not working for law enforcement. So I want to speak about white supremacy explicitly. So considering the history that this group clearly is aware of in the conversation that we're having, we've talked about trust, but now let's talk specifically about white supremacy. And we ask a question in the report that says, I'm going to read it here: if white supremacist ideologies are in the air we breathe and in the foundations of law enforcement, how might communities of color ever trust policing? And considering all the history, how do we think about the importance of white supremacy explicitly? Or I'm sorry, how do we talk about the importance of white supremacy explicitly? I'm gonna just leave that out there. You know, I'm an old school youth worker.
That question is so loaded, Justin. I will never ask communities of color to trust a system that embeds white supremacy within its everyday framework. I can never ask that of myself, and I can't ask that of those in my community. I don't think that's not the way towards freedom, you know, in the pathway that we are looking for. And so that bears the question: can our communities ever trust law enforcement in its current state? I don't think we can.
And so here's also the truth is that policing is the most violent arm of this state apparatus, right, of white supremacy. But policing is not the only way white supremacy hurts our communities, right? Like, for how police are to, you know, Black men, hospitals are to Black women, right? Particularly Black mothers trying to, you know, have babies, right? So there are social workers taking away and ripping apart Black families. And so that's why we have the African American Family Preservation Act that's going up, right? And so there are a lot of arms of how white supremacy through the government and through our institutions have harmed and continue to harm our communities. But you do not see our community saying, well, we no longer trust hospitals and just social workers. You know, some do. I'm gonna say that, some do. There's a good portion that does, but also that's in our Constitution, we were 3/5 a person, right? Black people were 3/5 a person in our Constitution and in how our government was set up. But we're not saying, you know, now I think most of people, I would say in the US, Black folk in the US, they still want to go vote. They still want to be a part of this government, right? And so there is a way to, if we see the change and we see the accountability and we can see the reform that happens, that it can happen. But unfortunately, you know, just as Amber said, I'm not going to ask somebody who has been harmed, who's been violently harmed by police, to trust the police. But we have to name the fact that we have to root out white supremacy, right? That it is a part of these institutions. And they don't want, I mean, I just don't understand why there's not even enough police officers, police chiefs, sheriffs that are naming and condemning white supremacy. You know, like that would be powerful. You know, that would be something where if the police actually took this seriously, because I wouldn't think that a police chief would want their ranks infiltrated by white supremacists, by the KKK, Proud Boys, or the Oath Keepers. I wouldn't think that that would be something that they would want. I would think that just as if they were, you know, being infiltrated by the Black Panthers or Hamas or some other, you know, organization, that they would want to name and condemn that, right? But it seems to be some hesitancy, right, around naming white supremacy and condemning it and rooting it out.
And I don't know that it's to their benefit. Nick, can I come to you with this question? How can communities of color ever trust policing?
I mean, the reality is we have to look at, you know, if we start where Amber took us, the history of it tells us the reality is policing is antiquated. Once we know what it was designed for, the reality is we've created a monster whose appetite is literally built off of the destruction of our communities and our dysfunction. And it's a forfeiture of resources that could be better spent in a myriad of different ways. So think about this. We're in a position right now where the whole world is watching the state of Minnesota, everybody, to see what happens with this trial. There's about 28 or $38 million being allocated for a response to possible backlash for a verdict. And if we thought the verdict was going to be in favor of the community, I don't think that we'd be spending 28 to $38 million in preparation of uprising. The dog whistle to our community is, you know, more than likely they're trying to figure out a way to lessen or let this officer off, which is only going to perpetuate what we're dealing with to begin with. As we look at that, realize that there's been tons of initiatives that have asked for resources, and they have years and decades worth of debates and everything under the sun. But the second one white man is in danger of going to jail, all of a sudden we can snap of a finger, there's 28 to $38 million to employ other white cowboys to come in and corral the uprising of people who are justly upset. The reality is we have to take a long, hard look at the systems that we've inherited. Some of these things need to be re-examined for utility. We don't need to rely on police going into the future. We need to literally stop asking the question of trusting something that we know is designed for our detriment, right? In white America, white officers, they have to take a long look at the history of where it came from, and that badge and that gun and everything that you think it is not, what it actually is. Now, willful ignorance is one thing, but the historical context, doesn't leave anything to the imagination. It lets you know clearly you were developed to oppress, period. You were developed to protect property over people, right? So the reality is, I don't know if trust is the right thing that we're looking for. The reality is we're striving to get to a point where we can wean this particular segment of law enforcement off of Black blood. We need them to lessen their appetite for feeling like they need to dominate a community that, on top of the disparities that they're already wrestling with, now we have to deal with you coming in cowboy fashion, killing people. And the reality is there's a sentiment that happens once you go through one of those type of scenarios in law enforcement. You get nicknames, you get, all types of monikers, Thumper. There's a lot of them that I remember as a kid. Officers who took Black lives and people looked at them like they were no joke, and now they're the tough guy inside of law enforcement. They get promotions, right? If we looked at the track record of the officers who have murders of Black people, unarmed Black people on their belt, where's their ranking? You see that they're moved up. The psychology is we're rewarding our killers, and the people who know how to keep the Black people in line is the sentiment. So when it comes to trust, the reality is, I don't think that we approach it with the idea of trust. I think we approach it with the idea of how do we get rid of the need for so many police officers in our neighborhood.
So I want to come back to that, but I'm just keeping in mind time. So we got about 20 minutes, and you guys are dropping like serious, in-depth, thoughtful comments, and this is really what we're here for. I mean, for lack of better words, it's really just to chop it up and just get people's genuine reactions. Marquita, I just want to create space for you on this question before we start to pivot a little bit here. Can communities of color ever trust police?
I'll be brief. No. No. I think it's not the operative question. I agree with the other panelists. It's just not the operative question. I think even if we look at it historically, as Amber started out the conversation with, you, as I recall, and as I look at the educational content that we have now in schools, in terms of history of Black folks, they usually start with slavery in America. When you're in school, K-12, the history of Black folks, it starts with slavery. So given that's the case, how about let's start history with white supremacy? I don't ever remember a K-12 class in the history of white supremacy. And since white educators are uncomfortable with teaching Black history, perhaps they'd be a little more comfortable teaching the history of white supremacy. So let's get them to do that. And perhaps in doing that, they'll begin to unpackage and unfold what they can hopefully come to aha moments and begin to understand the realities of the world that they indeed have created and its impact on others in the world, in the United States and otherwise. You still have the saying, the sun will never set on British Commonwealth, and that's because of the colonialism that they practiced early that we learned from, we were birthed from. So white supremacy is just something that they have ignored as a matter of fact and a matter of comfort. And I think it's high time they teach that.
Okay. So I just want to just real quick, I want to see what we can pivot to. So we have about 15 minutes. Katie, are you watching the chat? Are there any questions in the chat that you think you would like to read for us? I haven't been monitoring it actually.
Yeah, I think we can pivot to questions. There are a few questions, one in the Q&A and one in the chat that I think would be worth bringing up to the group for sure. So one question from the chat is about the fact that we're discussing white supremacy. And the question was, why are white people not at the front in solving this issue?
I'll throw that to Nick. What
Go throw it to me. Okay.
Consider it an alley-oop. Yeah.
I'll say this much. If everything you had was built around ignoring accountability, you probably wouldn't be in a rush to look in the mirror and see exactly how ungreat you actually are, in the sense of, did you really outperform, outthink, outwork anyone? If anyone else was put in your position with as many subsidies, what is your self-esteem really built on? And like I said, you know, they've developed a very specific taste for Black blood in every aspect. They monetize every area of Black dysfunction. So, you know, the reality is we need to see more white institutions, white agencies, political parties step up to the plate. How is it that we have this huge moment in the #1 issue that most white progressives are talking about have absolutely nothing to do with the historical context of their nephews and uncles and aunties who work in the police force, who are brutalizing Black people to this day in a fashion that literally violates human rights and dignity? How are you not talking about that? How are we approaching election cycles and that's not one of your critical key platforms that you're raking every candidate that wants your endorsement over the coals to make sure that they have a strong position on? Until we see that, we really won't see much of a response. You know, where are the white Lutheran churches who believe in God and humanity and everything else until they see outright murder and all of a sudden people have nothing to say? It's just crickets. But you love God, but you're gonna watch murder in silence. I don't understand how the morality works, but until they find the courage, because that's what this thing boils down to, until you stop cowering to accountability, I don't think this country will see the greatness. I don't think that white America will be free enough to actually live and someday maybe even not even be classified as white. You really don't want to get rid of the benefits of being white yet. And that's really what it's about.
Okay.
If you're really about it, put it on the line.
Okay. I want to hear from some of our other panelists on, my gut says people just have reactions. So Amber, Angela, Marquita, any reactions to what Nick is saying or the question?
Touche.
All right.
It's just the truth. It's just the truth. It's too much. All I was gonna say, there's too much protection. There's too much privilege. There's too much wealth. There's too much exaltation wrapped up within the system of white supremacy. And to be clear, I know that the report talks a lot about the explicit manifestations of white supremacy. I think one of the questions was like, why aren't white people at the forefront of addressing this? Is because I think there is a real disconnect for white people when they see white supremacy, right? Because to them, white supremacy is like, oh, you're in the Proud Boys, or oh, you're like saying white power. That's not me. I don't do that. Like, I just don't attack people because I'm white. And yes, that is maybe an explicit manifestation of the doctrine of white supremacy, but that is not the totality of the doctrine of white supremacy. It's so much more insidious and pervasive within every way of being in our country. And I think every white person needs to take time to really assess how that, first of all, what is that doctrine and how have I been indoctrinated within that system? And I think that is something that's a blind spot that's very difficult for a lot of white folks, especially we live in Minnesota, the Minnesota nice. It's very difficult for a lot of white folks to start to understand.
Okay, so briefly, Angela, because we're running up on time and I want to make sure we get a couple things in. Specifically,
I just want to recognize the fact that Black folk even under white supremacy, have thrived. And even thinking about like a place like Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1920s, the Black Wall Street, we have had so many fantastic Black wealth epicenters, but they were burned down, or those leaders in the Black community were lynched. Even thinking of how Huey P. Newton, of the Black Panthers, the leaders of our community and the epicenters of wealth have been burned. The people have been lynched and killed. And so it is not just coming from a place of Black people since slavery have not excelled. We have been trying to excel, right? And we have been, doing amazing, amazing things. But the issue of white supremacy is that it burns our communities down, it kills our leaders, and then erases the things that we give to America and did for America in this world.
So we have about 10 minutes, and I see there's a lot going on in the chat, Katie. So if you could pull up one more question, but I actually want to respond to that, because I think what you described, like, for example, like Rondo, building a highway through Rondo. Well, that was something that happened in cities all over the country, right? Treme and New Orleans and other neighborhoods all over, right? And at the same time, we see like I think we talk a lot about things that have been done to the Black community. And Nick, this is really like coming your way on reparations, but like we don't talk enough about what was done in counter to white communities. And so we have, on one hand, you build a highway through Rondo, but on the other hand, you incorporate Roseville as a city for displaced white folks, 2 years later. We have, the discrimination we have the insertion of like racial covenants, which the home that I own had a racial covenant in it. So like literally I'm the first Black person to live in this home. But we don't talk about the fact that like what redlining has done to create other middle-class white communities, or the denial of the GI Bill, or denial of farm loans, and the on and on and on. We talk about the denial to Black folks, but we don't talk a lot about the investment in the white communities that created the white middle class in our state. And I bring that up because I think the moment that we're in, if we're talking about trust in policing, we're talking about white supremacy, it's important to see how that works. How that, I think one of you made a point around, we found $38 million to bring in, new law enforcement into the city, but we can't find that same kind of money to solve issues in our community, solvable issues, right? Like a guaranteed income was a crazy idea a year ago, but now everybody is like used to getting big checks from the government. And so I bring this up because there are things that we can do, right? Like we can talk about these issues. The report says we should talk about this issue, says that we should collect more data. It says that we should take action through meaningful policy investments. And then we have to evaluate. We don't do the evaluation, the follow-up. And maybe it's just because I'm an organizer at heart, but I'm always following up with people. If you come to an event, you probably get a phone call from me, right? And at least back in the day, that's how I operated. And so I want to know, Katie, do we have any questions about policy or about things that I want to end this conversation talking about things that we can actually do? Because it's important we talk about this, but we also need some call to action.
Yeah, there are a lot of really good questions in the chat, but there is one around policy that I will bring up. So the question was, are there policy changes that you're supporting here in Minnesota that would move us in the right direction?
Yeah, to our panelists, does anyone have something off the top that they would like to share on this topic? I mean, obviously, Angela, I'm kind of looking at you for, you and I both testified during the hearing for Frazier's bill that would prohibit officers from being associated with white supremacist groups.
Yep, that's one. And then also there's the African American Family Preservation Act, which is not towards policing, but of course, just like Nick Muhammad said, is still a part of focusing on the Black community. And then there are definitely things that trying to work out on city level. So, you know, if you want to get invested in looking at the charter amendment that's coming down, particularly from the city council, that is not addressing fully white supremacy issues of policing. And it is, you know, that is something that if you live in the city of Minneapolis, will probably, perhaps, most likely be on the ballot. So looking at how the charter amendment, and then also there's a charter amendment on rent control that's coming down. So those are things that are happening pretty much right now. So, but the white supremacy, the Cedric Frazier white supremacy and policing bill is essentially, we testified on it, and I wish we had a video of the response, because literally the video, I wish we had that queued up for right now, because
yeah.
You know,
but you can go look it up afterwards.
Yeah, you can go look it up, but queued up for right now, because we're basically, you know, calling on legislators and policymakers and our representatives, right, to name and condemn white supremacy, and saying that as a state, we don't want known affiliated white supremacists in our police departments, right? And the conversation that happened afterward was essentially, I would say, gaslighting the Black community. And it was it was not justice. It was not that. It was essentially white folk being very uncomfortable of even talking about whiteness and white supremacy. And so we have a long way to go. But if you call your representatives and say, do you support, Cedric Frazier's bill for, having accountability and repercussions for known white supremacists in police departments, that'll be something. And see what your representative says. You guys see that we have some people who are out in greater the suburban Twin Cities. See what your representative says.
Okay, so we are short on time. I want to just first to say I apologize to the folks who have put comments in there. I see that the chat feature is really active. I will make a commitment to going through that and seeing if we can get answers from the panelists after the discussion. I think we need to close out. I have just like a few quick announcements, and then I'll give the last word to our panelists. So just a reminder that the Minnesota Justice Research Center, we focus on research, education, and policy development. The reason we're having this conversation today is because we think it's important to start with community voices first. We always try to go back to the community first when we put together a report or research. We want to talk to people who are living this, who work with organizations that are connected to the issue. And so with that, the next conversation we're going to have is with researchers and policymakers, and that's on March 26th. And so we invite you for that as well. We have a professor from University of Ohio Columbus, a law professor from, I believe it's Yale Law School, will be joining us as well. And then Cedric Frazier is committed, who's a representative, sponsored the bill that Angela just spoke about. And then on top of that, I just want to be clear that the MNJRC, that we haven't endorsed any policy. We haven't endorsed anything other than the idea that we need to bring people together to talk about these issues and figure out long-term solutions. And so we are committed to continuing to do the data, to do the research, to bring people together to wrestle with these ideas. Our highest intention is that we would wrestle with these ideas to come up with real solutions that work for everybody. We aim to be a bridge and not a divider. So with that, our last, just final comments, bumper sticker. What do people need to know about this topic going forward? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to say, I wanted to offer something a little different. I support and am really willing to take the lead on a constitutional amendment that defines policing. I think that everything has to emanate from a definition of policing, and we don't have that really on the books. And so what you get is a lot of one-offs in terms of policy changes, tweak here, tweak there, tweak the other place. Until we come together and define for the state of Minnesota a definition of policing that emanates from the Constitution and all other laws have to be a reflection of that, then we're going to keep doing this little one out, and it'll depend on what community you're driving through. I ought to be able to feel the same way, whether I'm driving through Minneapolis or Red Wing or all the way to the boundary, wherever I am in the state of Minnesota. And I should be expected to be treated and the same laws apply to me wherever I am. And until we have a constitutional amendment that does that, that defines policing as a public safety initiative, or however, whatever words we're going to use, I think that we're going to always be in these kind of conversations, and we're going to just circle. I used to read this book to my kids growing up, where this tiger was circling his tail until it melted in the butter. And so we're always going to be doing that. And I really would like to hear from anyone who is interested in that we might bring together somewhat of a constitution, one person from every county. Because if you talk to people in rural America, they will tell you policing in their communities is community policing. So we can benefit from that. So contact me about that issue.
Thank you, Director Stevens. Stephens. Bumper sticker, final thoughts. When I say bumper sticker, I'm thinking like something that'll fit on a bumper sticker because we're at time, but I want to make sure that people have a chance to just share their final words with us. Just short and quick. Nick, final thoughts?
Sure. First of all, Marquita, you can count me in on that amendment. Second, I'd love for people to join BCN. You can just email us info@blackcivicnetwork.org. We're looking for people across the counties to deal with reparations because we want to concentrate on the long-term solution. And we literally have an ambitious bill being authored by Senator Champion that will literally invest back into our communities, and hopefully the same way they came up with that 38 million and 28 million in the snap of a finger, they can actually go directly to the people they're claiming that they want to serve. And so we want to think long-term, we want to think permanent, and we want to actually change the trajectory for future generations. To Marquita's point, we don't want to keep having to chase our tail on this same issue. We want permanent change. And to us, reparations is the real litmus test. If you are against white supremacy, you should be in favor of reparations for the people who built the country.
Amber, thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much for having me this morning. And I just want to say that in the midst of all of these, we have all the ideas clearly. We have all the dynamic solutions, and being at the Capitol, seeing, us trying to fight for these solutions, it really shows the importance of increasing our representation and our power in these spaces. A lot of these dynamic ideas that are coming this session are coming from our newest Black legislators. And so in order for us to continue to drive these solutions home, we need to keep changing the political math, the amount of representation, the amount of people who are accountable to our issues. And so I just want to continue to press upon our communities to really think about how are we building political power in all spaces of government. I work in the state capacity, but in all spaces of government. So I just want to keep pushing that. I am always open for conversations about how we can continue to improve the conditions of Black folks here in the state. You can visit our website at mn.gov/CMAH. I'm going to put that link in the chat on Facebook and in Zoom, as well as my email. Feel free to always reach out to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber. Last word, President Morales.
And Myers, Angela Rose. So, if you are interested in taking on these types of issues, the NAACP is a place that you can come to. Membership is $30. You can go to NAACP.org to join. And then also just remember that we're at a point in our history where intentions don't cut it. Good intentions don't cut it. We need outcomes, right? And so we need to be looking at the wording, the language of our policies, and actually ask ourselves, does the language translate to an outcome? And if it doesn't, then we need to move on, right? We're past good intentions. Minnesota is 10,000 lakes, 10,000 good intention policies that didn't work for our community, right? And so we have to really focus and keep on pushing outcomes, because that's what we want to see. Well intentions and good intentions from our policymakers are not enough.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We had quite a few folks on the call tuning in and listening, and then even more watching online through social media. So I want to say thank you to everyone who took time. Katie, I want to say thank you for monitoring the chat, even though we didn't get to a lot of the questions. Let's talk offline about how we can follow up with people. And to our panelists, you guys, I just appreciate your honesty, your sincerity. This is not the most complicated issue. It's either we're going to have the courage to face this together as a state, or we're going to just ignore it and continue to let it to fester. And I don't think that's good for anyone. I'm often reminded by about Angela Davis's words: if they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the evening. And I just think people need to start recognizing that these issues are not Black people issues. That white supremacy is a white people issue, and we need y'all to deal with that. And we are happy to build bridges and to collaborate and work on how we can shift these structures, but we have to face these issues together. And so, with that, I just want to say thank you. Visit Minnesota Justice Research Center, MNJRC.org. Please support this work if you like what you see. If you have questions about how we operate and what we do, feel free to reach out to us at info@mnjrc.org. And we'll continue to evolve this conversation. Thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.